All right, let's do it. All right, well, thank you for being here. My name's Kaleb Stoppel, and I'm really honored to be here today. And you know, I come from a place of wanting to be a community member that is not maybe a clinician. I know not everybody here is a clinician, but by walking through and kind of surviving my own trauma and my continued kind of journey through trauma, it's really gave me a passion for wanting to be a part of the work in the mental health world. And so this is my first mental health conference here in KC. And so how I show up in this world, okay, is a father of two. I got two boys, 9 and 11. I have a wife who's a teacher, a high school math teacher. I am a former teacher. I spent 15 years in education, some on the Missouri side, some on the Kansas side, and most here in Johnson County in Olathe. And I started out as a high school math teacher, but then eventually became an administrator, 1 year at the middle school level and then at the high school level. And so my story and why I'm here today to share really changed a lot when I went through the school shooting at Olathe East High School 4 years ago. And I was actually the administrator that got shot when a student brought a gun to school that day. And so that's going to be a part of my story, but not as much of my story as what came after and what life has been like living after. Because as my kind of title a little bit kind of leans into, you know, the piece after trauma is not just about survival, but it's really about kind of putting your life back together and rediscovering a lot of things in your life. And so that's a lot of what I'm going to talk about. So today, as everybody comes in here, even though again my assumption is a lot of clinicians, maybe some community members that have some stake in mental health, but we all come with our own stories as well. And so I hope today, my hope in sharing my story is that when you leave, it will be able to have resonated in its own way. Whatever this space today brings to you, and whether that is through the ears and the eyes of a clinician, of thinking about those that you care for and that you serve, maybe it also might ring true in your own personal life. And that is what I hope, because we all come in here with a lot of lived experiences, stories, which also come along with successes, failures, grief, celebration, and through all that though, just like we're talking about trauma today, okay, there is a way to get through it all, and hopefully you hear that sense of hope. So my story is one about, you know, the life before and after a moment. And maybe, you know, already seeing some head nods, there's a lot of moments. Okay, some may be larger than others that happen in life. Some can be sad, you know, with grief, with loss of a loved one. Some can be happy, you know, welcoming a new family member to the world, any type of celebration. But up until this incident in my life, some of those milestones just kind of seemed like milestones. And that's not a bad thing, because we experience those every day. But what happens when those events are so big and that they do involve trauma, that they really do separate your life in my life before this incident and my life after? And really, how does one move on? How does one keep going after that life-altering event? And also, what is that person like after that life-altering event? And so that, again, that's a lot of what I'm talking about. So we know life moves fast, all right? I mean, again, with two kids, 9 and 11, busy wife, and I'm trying to figure out what life looks like for me. Sometimes it's hard just to keep up in that day. Thinking about your own professional and personal lives. You know, life is moving fast. And at what point in time, and I'll ask this to myself, you know, I got really good at that. I got really good at the grind. I actually kind of eventually thrived on the grind, because when we're working well and we're in the zone and we're serving people well, we feel proud about the work we do, we tend to start forgetting about the really important things, right? Because we're just keeping up with it, but we're in the zone. And so maybe you've been there too, in that you're proud of your work, you're happy it's going well, or maybe there's challenges that you're working through, but hey, I just got to keep laser focused on that. But the point is, we get really good at it. And that's not a bad thing, because that allows us to do what we're doing to the fullest, serve our clients, care for other people, but at what detriment, right? At what detriment? Because when we're getting really good at that, this is, for me personally, somewhere along that line, and fortunately for me, it was before the shooting. So here I was an assistant principal, athletic director at Olathe East. I started kind of late to check in on myself, but I started kind of wondering, how am I doing? Because I had stopped checking in on myself. I showed up, I did the job, I loved the kids, I loved the staff member, but again, I was the last person I was checking on. And so I hate we don't have this here, but I'll show you. You can't see it, but because it's my family, so So before life changed, this was who I was: school leader, a husband, a father. And I put this up here, and if we get a chance to go back to it, it'll make more sense. But of these 4 pictures, 3 of them are taken within the school. And so that's kind of an example of, that's just kind of what life was like for us. And, all the way back to when I first got to Olathe East, I think my kids were, maybe like 3 and 5. And some of those pictures were even taken on Sundays, because that's what our Sundays looked like at that point in life. My wife was still staying home with the kids, and so we would go to church, we would drive separate, because then I would go on to school. I would work for 2 or 3 hours. They'd go home and have lunch, and then they'd come up, and then we'd play around, and that's one of the perks of being a PK, a principal's kid. I grew up as a PK, believe it or not. My dad was my principal through 8th grade. And even though it stinks when you get in trouble at school, because yes, I did get in trouble. I wasn't perfect. And you got in trouble at home too. One of the perks was you could take up your little bicycles to school, and you could go around the gym. And so that's kind of what our life was. But then on March 4th, that moment that changed everything, is really what I'll focus on next when we talk about, life. And I thought I was going to be a career educator, not that I was following in my parents' footsteps, but that's what worked. I loved school leadership. I loved taking care of people. I eventually earned my doctorate. That was going to be my career. And this one date, this one moment changed everything, and it was March 4th. So a little bit about that day. So that day, it really was a typical day, and it was even like the second to the last week before spring break. So you guys all know what that kind of season of life is, whether you're a parent, a teacher, whatever you are out in that springtime, whether you get a spring break even, everybody loves the spring, right? And so the school is in its normal flow, typical day, nothing's really going on. And again, I'll kind of talk through this since you can't see it, but what happened that day? That morning, we had a student that came off the bus and went straight to her counselor. So really great for them, because she was reporting a concern of some boys that were sitting in some chairs in front of her that were talking about someone at Olathe East, a student, that had been bringing a gun to school. And so she was concerned enough that she went straight to her counselor after coming off the bus. That counselor did a great job listening, coming then straight to administrators that were there, and brought that concern to us. And so after we had that report, that's something that, in a large high school that we have in Kansas City, we had about over 2,000 kids at the time at Olathe East. And so it really wasn't that uncommon to start the day with kind of the hair on fire, not mine, about like, okay, we had a fight, coming in off the bus, or somebody made a poor decision of bringing alcohol to school. You could almost imagine the things that, and you guys probably remember being there too, of some of the things that happen in schools. But fortunately, we didn't really deal with weapons too much, right? In Johnson County, in Kansas City, it's possible, but this was one of the first times, to my knowledge, that a gun was actually fired in a school around this area. And so my point is that we took every threat and concern seriously, even if it was really unfounded and kind of silly and crazy to even think about. We had to take everything seriously. And so what we did is we brought in that particular student that talked to the counselor, and although she was very scared, she was very nervous, we were able to kind of live in that place as leaders, as high urgency of this is of the extreme importance, but also on the outside, calm. We're working with a young person. We're working with someone that's already going through her mental health needs and issues and trauma of this incident ourselves. And so it's a balance of trying to move that quickly, but also be in the moment so we don't add to that level of crisis. So after talking to about half a dozen more kids, we eventually got to a nickname. And that's kind of the crazy thing about that whole day is nobody really knew who this kid was by name because he was more well known by a nickname. And so finally, after talking to these kids, we realized that they were talking about a person with a nickname. Technology. Can you help with technology? Can she help? Okay. And we're back. I just feel so bad, guys. I'm so sorry. I just wanted this. Oh, man, I'm so sorry. But we'll keep going. Okay, so after we eventually get this nickname, you would think that a nickname would be so random and odd that it's like, okay, well, that actually did nothing for us either. But because that nickname was of a student that we had had a lot of interactions in, and me personally, the way that most schools break up 2,000 kids between like 4 assistant principals is we usually just divvy it up, and so by alphabet. And so I had kids with like last name A through D, and those are the ones that as things happen in the classrooms or as parents called in with questions or concerns, those would get at least routed, and it allowed us to be able to form relationships with, maybe that 500 that actually whittled down to maybe a couple hundred that we actually had some regular interaction with. The funny thing about this, though, or ironic, I guess, is the other assistant principal that was there, 2 of our assistant principals out, so it was just the principal and me and the other AP. As soon as that nickname surfaced and it kind of resonated, it's like we made eye contact and we knew exactly who this was, and we knew it could be really serious because this kid had some struggles, and we were working with him on that, whether it was academic struggles and intervention, whether it was behavior intervention. But even despite the challenges, we had a good relationship, and we'll talk about that later, how I know without a doubt that helped what happened that day and didn't allow it to be worse. So we have the nickname. We're pretty sure we know who that student is, but also something that was really important in school leadership, and I hope this is assumed at all schools, is that due process absolutely matters. Think of your own children if you have children, and whether they happened to be a witness to something or not involved, but their name comes up, we have to treat it seriously, but we have to do so in a manner that protects that person's dignity, but also it's really just straightforward, kind of innocent until proven guilty. And so there was, again, kind of stuck in the middle of this place of needing to act very quickly and seriously, but also, hey, we got to make sure that we're still able to know exactly what's going on and take our time to the sense we could. So we eventually find the student, we look up his schedule, and now it becomes that plan literally making on the fly, because we don't have time to sit down in my office and talk about this for an hour. We got to go find the student. And we knew he was in woodworking class. We knew that he and I had a good relationship, and so we had decided that the assistant principal would stay out in the commons area while I went in and tried to find the student, talk to the student, and ultimately, if he did have a gun on him, it's either going to be on his person or it's going to be in his backpack. And so I went in there, started looking for him. He was in another back room of woodworking, and not seeing his backpack right away, I thought to think to the student and say, okay, well, hey, let's go ahead. We're in the springtime. He was a senior, and we're trying to, doesn't sound good, but drag him across the finish line of graduation because he was so close, and we were working harder than he was some days to try to get him to graduate. But I knew he had his laptop with him, probably a student laptop. And so I said, hey, let's go in and let me steal you a little bit from wood shop. You got your laptop, right? Me thinking it's in his bag. And that's how I got him to try to bring his backpack. And come on, let's go back to the office. And this was not uncommon. I would steal him from class. We would have some check-ins, some of those interventions that you guys are probably well aware of, even with your clients. And that's where we brought him back to the office. But again, now once I got him out of the classroom safely, away from the 30 people or so, now if you've ever been to a large Shawnee Mission, Blue Valley, Olathe, Kansas City, they're big schools. And so now the next challenge is to get him through our big commons area to the office, all the while thinking through my mind, okay, what are the what ifs? And I know sometimes we can't beat those to death, but at the same time, that was what was on my mind, because there was about 36 students just milling around, not in class, in the commons area. And so as I'm thinking through, as I'm just kind of walking pretty casually, there were decisions that I made that a lot of school leaders make, and even you have to make some of these sometimes without on the outside people knowing what's going on, including like, okay, as we're walking, do I want him to be on the outside of me where the commons is, or do I want to stand on this side and he walk on this side where there's just a wall? And so those were things that naturally just kind of came through. But on the surface, it was just another assistant principal talking to the student, going in the office. He's not flipping out, so it seems like it's a normal situation. Oh, we got some tech. Hello. I just need to hook in, and then I didn't know how to select the input on here. So there's a C. All right, while she's doing that, I'll keep going. Okay, so we finally get back to the office. And this is where the other assistant principal decided to stay out for passing period, because, I mean, it's a pretty major event when you have 2,000 people crossing for about 6 minutes. And so she stayed out, not something we had planned. So here I'm still working with this student, walk in, we sit down together, I close the door, and we still begin to fill some time. And so now this is when I do look at with him his class progress. I ask him how his family is, if he's excited for graduation, fully still well knowing, I hope there's no gun involved, but with this kid there still might be. So finally the other assistant principal comes in and we sit down with him, and still trying to really not aggravate him and cause more crisis, we tried to kind of make a little bit of a ruse in the fact that, hey, by the way, now that you're here, this other assistant principal stopped in because we're working on something this morning in the school. And hey, while you're here, because we know you're pretty well connected, you got some friends, have you heard anything about somebody that has a gun at school today? And he was very quickly but comfortably, no, I don't know anything. Okay, hey, no problem. Appreciate you, help. We just thought we'd ask since you were here. But also, hey, by the way, what we've been working on through this investigation, and we've already talked to a lot of kids, is that we're following our policy and our protocol that we have to make sure every student is safe who we talk to about this. And that means we have to search you. Oh, you are wonderful. Thank you. Woo! Okay, I got to go back. There they are. So that's James and that's Luke. They're 9 and 11 now. So we just like I did. I grew up a lot in the school building, and so did they. So awesome. Okay. So let's fast forward. Okay. So we're talking to him, and we're kind of talking about, okay, we got to search you. No big deal. That's just kind of what we got to do when things like this come up. And it wasn't until he responded, nah, man, you're not going to search me, that inside things rose up immensely. But on the outside, okay, well, I'm sorry that you say that. And he's like, I just want to go home. It's like, dude, you can go home. That's no problem. But we have to do this. This is what we have to do to make sure everyone's safe. We've already been doing it all morning. Underneath the table, as we're all sitting there together, small office, I text the SRO and I tell him, not ask him, get in my office now. We had already talked to the school resource officer to let him know what was going on as soon as the threat was reported. We had already talked with our head principal. She was not the micromanaged type. She wanted to be in the loop, as you can imagine, but this didn't need a whole team of all of our administrators and counselors, because there's a lot of stuff going on at the same time in the building. But as soon as I text him that, he comes promptly to the office, closes the door, and I again try to plead with the student, hey, come on, man, let's just take care of this. I don't want to have to get him involved, but let's just take care of this. And he didn't really say anything, but he calmly stood up. And so kind of like maybe in whatever setting you've been in as a parent or in your professional, working with the kid, kids get rowdy or there's action, they stand up. sometimes you naturally stand up too and just kind of like maybe close the distance. There was a funny feeling about what was happening. The student calmly just kind of took his backpack from his back, took it around to his front, still looped on his arms. And that didn't really bother me too much because, again, some of the crazy stuff that administrators see is, kids were bringing a lot of vapes to school. They probably still do. I'm not there to have to deal with vapes, but they probably still are. But some of the kids I would work with would be like, no, I'm hugging my bag. I'm protecting my vape. You're not going to get it. So this didn't really bother me, even though I knew there might be a gun involved. But then very quickly, I'm standing up, the SRO standing up by the door, the other assistant principal still sitting down, and the kid reaches down, he grabs the gun out of the bag and just immediately starts shooting the police officer. And I mean, I bet we're so close that I could touch both of them like this, and I'm literally in the middle. So the student starts firing at the police officer starts firing back. And in that moment, I'll never know what happened to have me act the way I did. Like I said, I grew up as a principal's kid. I've never been in a fight. Me and my younger brothers, until we got too big to wrestle the way we were like, hey, we maybe need to chill out. We're too big now. Somebody's going to get hurt. But I've never been in a fight. But whatever happened in that fight, flight, or freeze mode in that moment, and here's where I can't remember. And so we know about like how trauma kind of protects the brain and the body. But what I've been told is that in that moment, as the shots were firing, I stepped out to tackle the kid, and I took him down to the ground because the next thing I remember, I'm on top of him, and he's kind of got his head pushed up into a bookshelf, and I'm prying the gun out of his hand, trying to wrestle that away, which I eventually do. And what else was I going to say? So in that moment, he's down on the ground, I'm on the ground as well. And I knew that something had happened because my back was on fire. I feel like I probably hit every table and chair on my way down. My shoulder hurt. But I think my adrenaline and everything else was pumping so much that all of this is happening in like 30 seconds, by the way, that I get the gun out, I slide it to the other assistant principal. And at that point, I kind of take a breath and I kind of like am able to quickly just kind of take in the moment. I see that the officer is, on his radio. I can see that I can see blood. So he was shot several times, 4 or 5 times, mainly in the limbs, but one was directly mid-center in his body camera. And so that's another really unique factor of what happened that day is there was really no video evidence. There's no cameras in my office. There's plenty in the school, but his body cam was destroyed with that one shot here. So he's taking care of himself, trying to call it in. I look down at the student now since the gun and the threat is gone, and that's when I'm able to again kind of take a breath and I see the student that I care about, not exactly only the threat, because that threat is hopefully eliminated. And that's when I'm able to start noticing that he's in pain, he's starting to vomit, and that's where I see that his midsection is bloody because he had been shot in the gut. And so the SRO, who's just an amazing hero and man, while he's taking care of himself, putting a tourniquet on and radioing, he tells me to roll the student on his side. And so now it goes from this extreme sense of like, oh my gosh, is this true? What are we going to do to it happened? And now we have this student that I care about that I'm trying to help, trying to tell him it's going to be okay, help's going to come. So we eventually, the first responders come, we all go to the hospital. The officer and I are released that same day. The student actually, even though he was apprehended, detained, he was in the hospital for like the next 2 months. Something I'll share every time I speak, I never ask permission to do this from the SRO, but he is such an amazing man. Listen to this story. So after I told you he had been shot 4 or 5 times, going back later and kind of watching some of the security footage, because even though I stayed home off work, I still had some of that access. So I was like, some people may think that's unhealthy. That was my way of staying involved. And I was able to see that this officer was able to walk on his own accord, surrounded by other officers. He was able to walk out of the building and to the ambulance. And just how someone could do that. Because my injuries, I was shot in the hip, and it was a through and through, about 8 inches long, about 3 inches deep. How that avoided anything, life life altering. How that one bullet didn't go anywhere else, that was life ending. And so the funny part of this is, as he was so, I want to say badass, but he was so cool to be able to walk out on his own, that when the first responders came to me, it's like no shame, and they're like, pants down and find it and bandage it, and they're like, okay, we got to get you out of here. We're not going to have you walk. Sit in your office chair, put your feet up. And so here I am when I see the videos of me, and I'm just like on a ride with my feet out, and here's this cop just like walking out after being shot 5 times. So anyway, he's my brother, and he saved lives that day, but I like telling that story. The also really quick ironic thing about what happened that day, which I do believe that things happen for a reason, is whether the student's gun jammed when I was tackling him, when I was disarming it, or just a random jam, his gun jammed, and it had several bullets left. And so, again, one of those we'll never know. We'll never know what would have happened. But a lot of things that day. Okay, I can talk about that for a long time. So that one moment, it changed everything. And again, that exchange of gunfire, being in that office, it might have been 60 to 90 seconds max. But that one moment changed not only for me, but and maybe it's impacted you. Maybe you remember watching some of that news coverage 4 years ago. Maybe you know somebody that was a parent of an Olathe East student. Maybe your child is friends with somebody. Maybe people don't have to know anybody at Olathe East, but that was a really big deal, and it still is in our city community. And so what happened that day, it obviously wasn't the hardest part. That was really hard, and finally being able to be reunited with my wife when she came to the hospital, and finally get to go home to see my kids and my own parents. That was all really hard and really special at the same time of getting to, go home. But it wasn't the hardest part, because trauma doesn't end after that moment's done. And here's going to be some of this where I'm probably going to see a lot of head nods, because I'm preaching to the choir of the work you guys do every day. But this is what I feel like is my purpose now coming out of that shooting, is talking about my story and about trauma, to the end of reminding anyone and everyone that trauma exists every single day. You don't have to go through a shooting to experience trauma. But multiple people can simply, get up on the wrong side of the bed, or a kid can have an argument with a parent and vice versa, and that's going to ruin the day, and that's trauma. Anything that comes in and impacts you like that. And so, of course, life didn't return to normal. What happened immediately after that is, of course, we had a week until spring break, and I was at home healing, of course. And I didn't know if I would ever go back to work. I was learning all this work comp stuff. Meanwhile, I was talking with the DA department, still talking with some detectives, and meanwhile, trying to, figure out how I was going to move forward. And I think for those first 2 days, a lot of my, what I need to figure out while I'm at home was a lot of physical, right? Because I immediately got to go to a trauma surgeon doctor that was able to, evaluate this, and I got a bullet graze on my arm. I had a torn rotator cuff from falling down, and then who knows what was up my back. It was just really badly bruised. But I ended up going to physical therapy for that, ended up going to the doctor for the injury, and then eventually started seeing a trauma therapist that I still see to this day. But it made me think a lot, back to this, is, a lot of people will say and be nice and be empathetic and care, which was so impactful and so wonderful. But they'll say things like, hey, you survived, or you helped others survive, you protected people, you're strong, you'll be okay. And although that does help, in the moment, it really helped, and I received cards and signs from Olathe East, and honestly, it probably meant more than I even know. But eventually, those things really weren't helping in what was starting to bubble up, because what people don't see is the confusion. Whether it was me trying to figure out, what does this mean for me and the career I thought I was going to do my whole life? What does this mean about me providing for my family? My everything was tied up in what I did, and now when that was at risk of no longer being available, I didn't know what to do. The disconnection, even though a lot of people were reaching out, at the same time, it kind of halted any of that social type of interactions that I had. Wasn't like I could continue to, reach out and say, oh yeah, remember we had plans to go to happy hour on Friday. Is that still want to do that? Everything stops. And this was something that I didn't realize until years later, thinking back and reflecting. But people don't see the pressure that sometimes, even though they have the best intentions of being kind and empathetic, is that there's a pressure to be okay. And I think that's when the conflict started rising in me, because things started feeling differently. In fact, the first time, so it was that same week, and it was about midweek that I finally started feeling things I've never felt before. And not that I've ever been someone who's never experienced mental health challenges, because I think that was called sleepless nights and having a rough conversation with a parent or a staff member that you brought home and perseverated on and couldn't move on from. That was mental health challenges that I had, and I didn't even realize it because I thought it was just part of the job. But it wasn't until that week that now I started physically feeling things. I started feeling depression. I started feeling mood swings. I started feeling anxiety, things that I'd never truly felt before. I feel like I had helped students. I'd done plenty of work in that space of helping with interventions and accommodations, but it was scary. And it was to the point where I didn't know what to do. And so I wasn't thinking very intentional about it, but this was back to the survival. I reached out to one of my friends who happened to oversee the counselors in Olathe School District, and we'd worked together to help many students. And I called her because at that moment, that's who I trusted and that's who I thought I needed. I said, something's wrong. And I said, I think I need help. And kind of talked to her about what was going on. She talked to me, and then immediately through her network, and this is kind of so full circle about why being involved in the mental health space now, serving on the board with Johnson County Mental Health Center means so much to me, because that person called someone at Johnson County Mental Health, and at the time it was one of the assistant executives or executives, I didn't really realize, and she showed up on my doorstep within 2 hours and was like, hey, let's talk, what do you need? And that was my first experience of therapy, of asking for help, of being the person that doesn't know the answers, coming from a place where, not that I always knew the answers, but I was the person kind of in charge of figuring stuff out. And so, that was when I realized I needed to start moving forward. And ironically, the burnout phase was already starting to sink in. At Olathe East, I absolutely loved that job, and I think I loved it too much. And there's a really fine line, and maybe some of you guys know that. But for me, what that looked like, because I had such young kids, because my wife was staying home, and because of how the schedules worked of when school starts, is I already had to be at school earlier than they did. And so when I got up about 5 o'clock, which was my usual time, and nobody was awake, and I could either get some work done at home, I should probably been sleeping, but that resulted in, well, I'll just go to school and get a couple hours of quiet work done. And then waking up at 4 came waking up at 4:30 so I could get to work at 5. Then it became waking up at 4. I mean, you see where this is going. And then on top of that, the day usually didn't end on most nights until 10, 11, or midnight, because there were basketball games, there were football games. And so really what started breaking me down, even before the shooting, was that I was feeling so guilty, because here I would go through my normal day and I didn't want to be the one to let anybody down. But now I would realize that it's been 3 days or so since I even seen my own kids. I would run into my wife because we could be up late and things like that. And so we had decided, hey, let's go ahead and move to Wichita. My wife's from Wichita. I grew up in Western Kansas. And so we thought, this is the move. Let's just do it. And I was able to get hired at the school district there in Wichita as a district athletic director, overseeing all the sports and activities for all the high schools and middle schools. And so it felt like a fresh start, right? And so I did try to push through. We've been talking a lot about that today, about maybe that not being the best push through and be tough, but that's still a little bit about what I was trying to do. I told myself I was fine. I focused on being a leader, wanting to meet all the people in the new organization, wanting to get into the new system, learn the new system, but I wasn't fine. And it wasn't until the newness wore off that everyone, I think, was pretty cordial to me as the new guy. I was trying to meet people. But once that all kind of settled down is when I truly started seeing and feeling some things that I think even increased and exacerbated the trauma that I was feeling. And a lot of that came to connection. So that's why in the beginning, and I was probably off my rocker when I was unorganized, but in the beginning I talked about how we show up in life. And that's something that has a lot to do with belonging, because it's not only who you are and what you do, but it's why you do it. It's who you do it for, and it's what matters in your life. And so when I didn't feel like I belonged, I didn't have that connection like I did back here, my anxiety and depression went out the roof. And it was almost too much to handle. Then I started questioning, things were still moving along back in Kansas City. They were still, talking about the shooting here and there. Obviously the community was still working through that trauma. But I started thinking about that and started thinking about, well, okay, did I even do things right? I mean, everybody walked away alive, but, there was that perfectionism in me that was still creeping up, even like, how did I do it? This is where things really, another moment, I guess. And I'll preface to say, no one could have anticipated and no one was trained what to do down that day. From students to staff to myself to the superintendent. Now we do fire drills, right? We do tornado drills. We even do active shooter drills. But I'm here to say that no one's ever actually sat down, gave me a manual, or we spent a day tackling someone on like what to do if someone takes a gun out. Okay, that's just something we don't do. And so when I was still trying to stay connected, again, whether it was healthy or not, this was what I felt just like that I had to do, watching board meetings, watching the news that was still going on back home. And on one of those board meetings, back from August of that next school year, the school district was presenting back to the Board of Education. And this was basically during their like, here's our conclusions of the investigation. Here's what we found. Here's what went well, and here's what didn't go well. And underneath the category for essentially needing improvement was this statement. And I will say this, that I hold no ill feelings for anyone. Because like I said, being a superintendent, going through, probably for the first time in the Olathe district history, I don't know, maybe it's not a good stat anybody wants to keep, but that superintendent probably never thought he'd go through having to deal like something like that in his career. That Board of Education, all those things. So I hold no ill feelings because I don't know if I would have done it better. But this, and even to this day, it still is hard for me to deal with. But that's one of the pieces I think of coping, that even though that is one narrative, I can paint the narrative that I want, and the narrative that I choose, whether evaluated on whether I did it right or not. All four of us walked away alive. No students were hurt. That incident was contained to the office. It was a 1 in a million shot that it all happened the way it should. And so that is an example of how this still bothers me, but also I can reframe it to remind myself that, hey, what happened that day was what was meant to happen. And those actions, even though no one told me what to do or trained me up, it just happened. I just got to be okay with it. But I carried that with me. I mentioned I still carry it with me. But, eventually we needed to come back home. None of us were as happy as we thought we were. My wife and I had basically spent the better part of 20 plus years as adults in the Kansas City area. Some of that even before we met. My kids started school in Olathe, and so we knew we needed to come back to that. So life is throwing us around ragged here, and we're just not really thinking about anything except for what do we need. But of course, I was exhausted. When we came back, fortunately, I found a job at a school district on the Missouri side up in Park Hill as an assistant principal and AD because I wasn't ready to give up. I still knew deep down that that was the world I knew, that was the life I knew. I'm getting pulled a little bit to try to be more mindful of things I got to do better as a dad and a husband, but I still just wanted to serve people, and I wanted to do that. But I was starting to break down mentally, emotionally, physically. Again, things that I'd never experienced before, but anxiety and depression were really starting to cripple me. It was at this time that I finally got on medicine, which I know it may or may not be the right thing for people, but it's just what is their individual plan. But for me, that finally allowed me to experience a break, some relief, and I can't speak to that more. But again, I keep going. So I'm trying to take care of myself. I'm seeing the therapist. I'm taking medication, but I'm also still got some of that trained grit in me that isn't the healthy grit of just trying to work through and push through. And I was running into a lot of the same challenges there. I know the grass isn't always greener at a new organization. And I know that I had a really good thing at Olathe East because we were so close on that administrative team that at Park Hill, it wasn't the same either, very similar to Wichita. And that was equally as crushing. And that's when I realized that I had to leave education. And that happened mid-year. So it wasn't ideal for the school district, wasn't ideal for me, because I left that job with no job. And actually probably never again a job in education. So I was like, what the heck am I gonna do now? Because that was my sole identity. So that was one of the problems that I think I heard another speaker today mention how when your identity is solely locked up in what you do, what happens when you no longer have that? And I experienced that. But the messages that I can share with you all is that it doesn't have to be a life-altering, super unique story of a school shooting or getting shot to be able to feel like you've lost yourself. And again, maybe you've been there because you guys deal with a lot of emotional, traumatic situations and people, and you are the leader that's looked upon to be the one to help others. And so that's a lot for you guys to take home, and not too much different than that particular day. The principal that had to go through the reunification of getting 2,000 kids safely to their parents, the superintendent probably had a heck of a day. And so that trauma-informed care concept comes into play here a little bit. I'm just throwing this out there, of how do the people that take care of others, like you, like those administrators, at the end of the day, who takes care of them? Who takes care of you? And if there is no one, if there is not maybe a culture of trauma-informed care all the way to the top, which not many places maybe will do that, then it's up to you guys to be able to know what you need to be able to take care of yourself. And that's sometimes a little bit harder to do than it is to say. So somewhere along this line so after I left that job, I realized that I couldn't keep doing the same. I had to slow down, like I couldn't keep that pace up. I had to be honest with myself because here, again, like the hardest decision I've ever made is choosing to not pursue another job in education. But this meant what am I good at? That's all I've ever done. And so many educators, if you have educator friends or family members, feel the same, which I want to debunk because I think educators have so many transferable skills. But even at the time, that was hard for me to understand. Okay? And I had to face what I was avoiding because I wasn't able to just snap my fingers and be okay. I was healing up physically, but mentally and emotionally, I was still a wreck. And then here I'm trying to figure out, how can I provide for my family? We still have bills to pay. We still have this to do. And so I really had to come at some hard realizations, and a lot of therapy helped me through this, is healing is freaking hard. Okay, it's slow. It doesn't happen right away like you want it to. It's one step forward and 20 steps back. It's messy. It's uncomfortable. And even though on the good days, like today, where I'm feeling confident, I love speaking about this because this helps me selfishly along my healing journey. It doesn't mean that I'm going to crash out tonight or tomorrow after experiencing this high, in that the mental health sneaks up on you. Anxiety and depression, the whole body keeps the score thing is legit. because I experience it less and less because I am more comfortable talking about it. But that doesn't mean my body's not going to surprise me and all of a sudden I'm just going to hit me out of nowhere and it's like, oh my God, where'd this come from? And so, but it's something I'm starting to realize, not just talk about. But things did start change. Not all at once, but I started to see things differently because it really made me look at, instead of thinking about, man, this sucks, I loved education and now that's been taken away from me. Instead of focusing on that, instead of focusing on what the heck am I going to do so that I can help provide for my family so we don't have to move or we don't have to do, how can we keep things going? But because everything I thought mattered, the job, the role, what I did, the impact I have, which all are mostly important, I actually realized didn't matter at all. Like, who cares, right? Because probably they had my job posted. Now, they probably had to go a little bit longer, but they had my job posted at some point. It's a job, okay? And so what I had overlooked and what I still remind myself today is that everything was right in front of me that I was seeking and trying to connect with of what really matters, because it was my family. It was my wife. It was my 2 kids. It is those things, and it is trying to be the healthiest I can be for myself and for them. And everything that matters most was right in front of me. So when I was trying to chase peace, or when I was wanting to achieve peace, all of that was possible. Even back when I was working in education, I just didn't have a very good priority balance of it all. And so in kind of the last few minutes here, resilience is a huge part of my journey and a huge part, I think, of anyone who's lived through trauma, and how you come back from that, how you continue to hopefully take things from your life before that are still part of you, but then have to replace some of those things that are not possible anymore. Because resilience, I learned, is just not surviving, but it's that journey of rediscovering what matters most. It took going through that shooting. It took picking up some things through therapy. It took, the really hard days and then the small wins along the way to be like, what is life about? Well, it's not making the most money. It's not chasing the job. It's really not even having the full leadership impact, even though that's still a passion of mine. It's for my kids. It's for my wife. Like, there's nothing more in life that matters. And even if people out there right now or in general, don't have kids, don't have some of those things, that there's a lot of things in life that you can answer what matters most to you. And that's something that I hope to put on a lot of people's minds as I talk about this, is because if we can ask ourselves that more, and we can actually think more about that, then it doesn't mean that what you're doing right now in life on your work-life balance or how you take care of yourself or lack thereof, everybody has their own way, and that's fine. But if at some point you're not able to press pause and kind of ask that question of like, why the heck am I doing this again? And what really matters? Here's a quick little aside. One of the books that I read that was a tremendous help to me that got me through some of my darkest times is by Mark Madsen, called The Subtle Art of Not Giving an F. And honestly, and I know there's a lot of self-help books that say the same message, a little bit less PG-13, but it really helped me realize, like, why am I caring about stuff that it may be important, but by caring about that and giving all of my F's to that, at the end of the day, what do I have left to give to this stuff over here that really matters? And so also during some of my hardest times, last session we were talking about well-being in here and kind of coping strategies. When I really started struggling a lot and, was going through therapy and trying to remember things, I found that physical coping reminders really got me through. And so I have a bracelet that has faith, family, friends, and then the names of my family members. I have a one step at a time to remind me of the work that I'm doing. And then I have one that says guard, W-Y-G-A-F-A. Guard what you give an F about. And so that is along these same lines of like, what matters to you? Are you prioritizing it, and are you protecting it? And again, that comes off a lot of different ways. But not only when life is going good, okay, but especially when it isn't. So again, you don't need a moment like mine to be able to ask that, because we all have afters. And again, they could be small and they could be natural pieces of life, and that's okay. But if we're not spending time, or maybe speaking to you now as clinicians as you're working with clients and thinking about how they're navigating a traumatic event or just daily hard lives, okay, because it's not just surviving. Not just surviving. That's one piece of the puzzle. And so for me, what began as that journey of rediscovery actually became about returning to what matters most. And so that's when I kind of shared, when you have an event that cuts things in before and after, that doesn't mean your old self is gone and now you have to recreate your whole life. That's not true. But there are aspects of what came before that are just going to be really hard, if not impossible, to continue. For me, education, how I was able to impact people, how I was able to serve in that role, that's gone. And I grieve that. That sucks. And I still feel a certain way about that. But on the flip side, it made me then think more about the stuff that I don't want to let go of, that I didn't even have to make a choice. It's still part of me. And it's that sense to care for others. I know I still want to serve and lead and care for others. I know I still want to be the best dad and husband I can be. And so that's where the returning to what matters most. So as we wrap up here, and we got maybe a couple questions, or time for some questions, but I want to leave you with that question that I keep coming back to you. What truly matters in your life right now? Okay, and whether that's something that it jogs something right now, or tonight while you're thinking about what you listened to and saw today, or it may not pop up until down the road when you have a pretty crummy day or something happens. I hope that this little piece from today, nothing about me, okay, but think about in your life, what is that priority? What's rooted in your life that will be bigger than any type of challenge, any type of bad news that you get? And because that will be something, I believe, that will help you get through trauma and help cope with trauma. Because something I've learned too, that you guys would probably all agree, or maybe, not being the professional in the room, is trauma, I'm not going to beat it. I'm not going to outpace it. I'm not going to get rid of it. In fact, the way I've chosen to think of it is, here's my buddy trauma right here. And it's going to be with me the rest of my life. And I'm okay with that from a sense of, I recognize that's my life now. I recognize that I have support. I have my family. I'm understanding my triggers, and I'm understanding that there's still going to be crappy days, and I understand that I'm going to have to work through that. So again, but it started with small steps, just like I explained even right after the shooting. But now what's always on my mind is slowing down, taking time to pause, taking time to protect what matters most, okay? Whether it's through reminders or being intentional about my time and my decisions, and actually prioritizing it in my life, okay? And here's something that I can talk to you as professionals right now as we wrap up, because this was really hard for me to do, and I didn't figure it out when I was in education. I didn't figure out the proper balance. And honestly, balance implies 50-50, and I don't think it's ever a 50-50, but I think it's all about prioritizing. But now that I found a new career as a financial advisor, and I love that career because it allows me to continue to serve and care for people in ways that I did in schools, but now in pretty life impactful ways. Life insurance, people like me, I almost didn't come home that day. And what would have that meant for my widowed wife and my kids without a dad? And so I learned that you don't have to choose. You don't have to choose between doing meaningful work, going all in, loving your job, and also taking care of yourself, okay? Because I've now learned that I can do both. And that's why, whether it's speaking about mental health or writing my book or being a financial advisor or simply saying, I'm leaving, it's 3:30 and I'm gonna go home, and because I know my kid's gonna wanna play baseball catch, it's possible for all of us. And I'm not doing it perfectly, but now I see what's possible. And remember, whether it's you in your personal life, your clients, you don't ever have to have it all figured out. It's freaking messy, okay? And you're gonna have good days and bad days. Everybody, that's kind of life. But something that I hold myself to is taking the next step, reminding myself that hope is always possible. This morning, the keynote, he talked about people, I think, that are optimistic and cynics and stuff like that. Yeah, I'm always try to see the optimism in things. And I know hope is always possible. You just have to look for it and you have to be open to it. Because if you do that, I'm very, very confident that light will find its way in. And by light, I mean hope. I mean being able to take on the next thing, whether it's one small step, whether it's taking on what happens the next day. And last but not least, everyone has a story in here, okay? Whether your professional hat or your personal hat. Your mental health matters. Again, I love that I'm talking to clinicians and professionals today because you guys have both those hats on too. But your mental health matters because you matter. Here is, I'm going to put this up on the next slide too, but here's my contact information. I'm sharing a lot, trying to be that mental health advocate. So I'm starting to share some more on social media. My book, in the beginning of this, and I know we're at time, so we'll get wrapped up here, but in the beginning, one of my coping strategies was try to journal through what I was feeling, and whether it was voice journaling, was writing. And it was this time, last May during Mental Health Awareness Month, that I finally felt comfortable to start sharing some things out on social media, something that was very hard for me. But I got such good response back that it made me feel like maybe this is like one of my new purposes, is to share my story, even though it's hard to share sometimes, even though it's not as hard to admit that I struggle with mental health issues, but also that is what resulted in this book. And I would love to have the chance to get this book out to you guys. The conference has been kind enough to allow me to have some space at the book table tomorrow, 10:15 to 11:15. It is on Amazon. And honestly, if you reach out to me and you just let me know that you have some people that you serve, I would love to hand out as many books. So if for your organization or for people you work with, after you've had a chance to read it, I would love to be a help in that. So I went over about 30 seconds. Thanks for the patience with the technology, and thank you for coming to listen today.
Reminder, maybe ask you who have not met Brian, but that please do something for her. Then also, please remember to fill out complete the session evaluation that's on the app.